For some reason, I was no pace, mate.
Can you imagine Lewis Hamilton, the world heptacampion, saying on radio that has no rhythm in a free practice? How bad it has to be Ferrari for that to happen. Stay, because this radio message is much more than a complaint. It is the reflection of a deep crisis within the most emblematic team of Formula One. It all started in practice 2 of the 2025 Austria Grand Prix. Lewis Hamilton, who this year decided to leave behind a complete era with Mercedes to pursue a last great deed with Ferrari, ended up being the protagonist, but not for the reasons that everyone expected. The British, who arrived in Maranello with the illusion of returning his champion status to the team, found a machine that does not respond to his talent. During the session, Hamilton delivered a phrase that was already marked in the season. "I got no pace, mate." It was not a simple complaint. It was an honest, raw, and devastating statement. Because when one of the best pilots of all time admits that their car has no rhythm, the problem transcends the configuration of that day. We are talking about a technical and emotional crisis that affects the project in its nucleus. That message encapsulates much more than it seems to the naked eye. Not only is the impotence of an experienced pilot, but the evidence of a total disconnection between what is planned in the Maranello factory and what translates into the track. It is the confirmation that the promoted SF25 not only has not met expectations, but has left its own disoriented pilots. Hamilton's performance in that practice was, in fact, a numerical reflection of his frustration. He ended 10th with almost a second difference with respect to the best time of Lando Norris. And the most revealing is that his teammate Charles Leclerc did position himself in the top 5. That gap cannot be justified solely by driving style differences or fine configuration settings. Here a deeper component comes into play, the lack of synchrony between Hamilton and its technical environment. Lewis is still in the process of adaptation, yes, but in a team with championship aspirations, his star pilot cannot be allowed to be dark regarding the behavior of the car. The filtered radios from the session show a confused Hamilton, trying to understand why the car does not respond as it should, why the sensations on the track do not match what the data in the garage indicates. This type of break between perception and technical analysis can only be due to 2 things: a lack of reliable feedback in telemetry, or a car design that is simply incoherent in its behavior. Hamilton's body language when getting off SF25 also said everything. Serious, crestfallen, without the slightest sign of satisfaction or tranquility. It is not just a matter of positions in a timesheet. It is the disappointment of having arrived at the team with more history of Formula One to meet a project still under construction, plagued with inconsistencies. In that sense, this free practice was much more revealing than a classification or a career. Because when track conditions are more open and cars can show their true potential without strategic restrictions, everything that works and everything that fails becomes evident. And what failed in that practice was much more than the car. The communication failed, the forecast failed, the emotional management of a team failed to be wrapped in his new star and, on the other hand, lets her speak in the void. If Hamilton's radio was the symptom, the disease is a project that, at least for now, does not have a clear direction. And that, in Formula One, can be lethal. Ferrari arrived at the 2025 Austria Grand Prix loaded with expectations and with a narrative built around a new aerodynamic package that, in theory, had to mark a before and after in the performance of SF25. There was talk of a substantial redesign of the car, which included changes in the side fences, adjustments in the shape of the Venturi tunnels, and a complete redistribution of the diffuser volume. The promise was clear: to increase aerodynamic load throughout the car's operation range without compromising its balance. But the reality on track was a very different one. What should be a technical revolution ended up being a barely cosmetic intervention in terms of effective performance. Lewis Hamilton, with all his experience and sensitivity to the behavior of the car, had already anticipated it in the statements prior to the weekend. His skepticism was evident when he expressed that they were not receiving the usual feedback on how much aerodynamic load was really generating, and that they did not expect a great leap. This statement not only revealed a lack of trust, but a worrying disconnection between the technical department and the pilot. For a structure like Ferrari, which has invested so much in returning to the top, having its star pilot openly doubting the technical package is not a leadership signal, it is an alarm signal. Technically, what Ferrari tried was a structural correction of the deficiencies they had been dragging from the first race in Australia. The SF25 had shown from the beginning a worrying aerodynamic instability, with areas of the car that lost suddenly during the passage by curve, forcing the pilots to compensate with more aggressive entries or loss of time in traction. the modifications in Austria did not address that root of the problem. They limited themselves to optimizing the generation of load in ideal conditions, but without solving the inconsistency in the dynamic behavior of the car when it is outside the optimal operating window. The most frustrating of this scenario is that Ferrari does not seem to have learned from the recent past. The tendency to present great improvements that does not finish working is already known. For years, the Scuderia has fallen into the trap to pursue solutions that look good in the wind tunnel or in the CFD simulations, but that fail on track because they do not translate well under real load in variable conditions of temperature and pressure. The case of SF25 is another example of that failed pattern. Although on paper the modifications seemed promising, Hamilton's feedback and the results of the practice made it clear that the structural problem remains present. In addition, we must point out a key issue: the conservative philosophy that Ferrari adopted for this development. Instead of risking with a completely new design that attacks the fundamental defects of the car, they opted for an incremental approach, probably not to compromise the reliability of the package at a delicate time of the season. But in Formula One, technical mediocrity is usually the result of half decisions. There is no room for warm developments when your rivals, such as McLaren and Red Bull, are pushing the limits of the technical regulations in each car area. The final result was a car that, despite the modifications, continued to show erratic behavior in medium and slow curves, difficulty finding optimal temperature in rear tires, and a balance that radically changes between different fuel loads. In other words, a car difficult to predict and even more difficult to maximize. Hamilton, with his technical baggage, felt it from the first moment. And he said it without filters. There is no rhythm. There is no address. And the worst, there is no clarity about when it will be solved. But what really tells us that Hamilton radio, that already famous "I got no pace, mate"? Much more than it appears at first glance. It is not just a phrase thrown into the air by the frustration of the moment. It is a serious symptom of a structural disease within Ferrari. When a pilot such as Lewis Hamilton communicates in this way with his engineer, he is not asking for immediate solutions. It is evidencing a loss of faith in the project. At that moment, what we hear is not a technical complaint, but an emotional confession. Hamilton feels that Ferrari is not giving him the necessary tools to compete. And if that happens in a free practice, the problem is deeper than many imagine. The phrase has multiple layers. It is, above all, a cry for answers. Because Lewis is a meticulous, obsessive pilot in detail, someone who has built his career dominating all aspects of his technical environment. If he does not find the rhythm, it is not due to lack of talent, but because the car does not allow him to apply his driving style. That inability to extract performance speaks not only of a poorly conceived machine, but of an environment where solutions seem more an accumulation of patches than a coherent direction of development. This radio message, therefore, must be understood as the reflection of a crisis of trust. In modern Formula One, where adaptation time is minimal and error margins are reduced to thousandths of a second, not having confidence in the car is equivalent to losing half a second by return. And in the current context of the 2025 season, where McLaren marks the step, Mercedes threatens to consolidate and Red Bull clings to his competitiveness, Ferrari cannot afford that loss of time. Not in the hands of a pilot like Hamilton. Not when you are trying to build a winning project from the foundations. But there is something even more alarming. The feeling that Ferrari is beginning to enter a self-destructive cycle that has lived before. The team seems to have returned to patterns that were already believed to be overcome. Lack of clear technical direction, poorly bold strategic decisions, poorly managed internal pressure, and poor communication between track and factory. All this is amplified when the most media pilot on the grill begins to publicly doubt the project. Because Hamilton is not just an athlete. It is a political figure within Formula One. Each word of yours has an echo. Each phrase on the radio becomes a holder. And in this case, that echo rumbled as an imminent collapse signal. Ferrari, in addition, cannot afford to repeat historical errors. Not after having invested in renewing its internal structure, of having opted for an elite pilots and having publicly committed itself to a more rigorous and scientific work philosophy. However, that promise seems to have been diluted as soon as the first turbulent signals arrived. And this is where Hamilton's message takes on an even greater dimension, because not only denounces a technical failure, but exposes an institutional inconsistency. The car doesn't work. The management does not respond. And the most experienced paddock pilot is already saying it out loud. If a pilot like Lewis Hamilton, with 7 world titles behind him and decades of experience competing to the highest level, feels lost in the middle of a practical session, then we are facing a situation that transcends the sports. This is not just a bad weekend or a bad update. It is a reflection of a gradual decomposition within Ferrari, which again shows the cracks of a project that seemed renewed. What should have been a resurgent stage with the arrival of a historical figure such as Hamilton, today is tarnished by the same ghosts that have persecuted Scuderia for years. Technical instability, disconnection between pilots and engineers, and a chronic inability to capitalize on their enormous infrastructure and human talent. So now I leave you this open question. Do you think Ferrari has the time and ability to reverse this situation before Hamilton completely loses faith in the project?